Where I came from, people never dreamed of venturing out. They just lived and died there. Grew up with families, and a few of them went to Detroit and Ohio to work in the graveyards and the car factories. But I'm talking about venturing out into areas that we didn't understand. To me, a little kid coming from where I did and having that ambition and saying I wanted to be a star, people would say, well, it's good to daydream, but don't get carried away. People would say you can't do this or you can't become this. Well, if you don't think you will do it, nobody else will think it. I've got more confidence than I do talent, I think. I think confidence is the main achiever of success. I really do. Just believe in you can do it. You can imagine it to the point where it can become reality. When I made my change to do what I'm doing now to appeal to a broader audience, people said, you can't do that because you are going to wreck your whole career. You're going to lose your country fans and you're not going to win the others. And then you're going to have nothing. You better think about that, girl. That didn't matter to me because I knew I had to do it and I knew I could do it. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Barry Lee Pearson's You Know What You're Going to Get Now? Interviews. It's a chapter from Sounds So Good to Me, the Bluesman story. I really love this chapter. I love Pearson's work because, he's a scholar of the blues and had done extensive interviews with bluesmen in that same wave of interest in the blues that basically started in the late 50s, early 60s. It was tied into the folk revival. It was tied into a whole bunch of earnest white dudes who were rediscovering traditional music, African American music, and went out and sort of took it upon themselves to try and rediscover. And it was the beginning of sort of the niche audiences that, like Living Blues Journal, which is a magazine, engendered. And, it's like much of the folk revival, it was thrust, or it emerged with this sort of strange sense of a dissatisfaction with popular music and the direction the music was going, and a hunt for what was considered more authentic. So all the blues music from the 20s and 30s that had been recorded, that was available in 78s and so on, some of which had made it into the Anthology of American Folk Music by Harry Smith, some of which was just circulating in the background. This generation went out and tried to rediscover them. And there were some successful rediscoveries. Son House was a hospital janitor in Rochester, New York. And basically someone called him up and said, excuse me, are you Son House? I said, yes. Well, I'm an eager graduate student. And he had a second career. Much of his work has to do with the second career. It's not that this isn't a white savior narrative by any stretch of the imagination, nor should it be interpreted as such. But basically, there was a new market emerged, and it was a market that was encouraged by the folk revival, and the bluesmen came. And came back. And of course, like the English blues fascination, the same thing that Clapton and the Stones and, everyone, the resurgence of Muddy Waters and the like. What's Muddy Waters, that Red album. I'll find it and I'll put it on. But it's basically, it was sort of co-produced or at least co-encouraged by Clapton and the Stones. And it's Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. There we go. So this is part of this. But Pearson was sort of recognizing that half of what the people were doing is not simply going out and finding these people and encouraging them to tour again, to perform again, to reestablish careers, which they didn't need much encouragement about. They just needed that opportunity. And but what was really fascinating is, and what sort of Pearson's big insight, is that what the audience for this blues revival was looking for were narratives that basically spoke to the authenticity of the music tradition itself. Because blues has that built into its aesthetic appreciation. I don't think it's one of those things that is a necessary form of blues, but I do desperately grasp that it is part of the cultural understanding of what constitutes blues, is that it has this emergence from lived experience, that it is a particular artistic response to having had a life that would engender expression in this particular way. So it has markers of racial aspects to it. That sort of classic question. And there are articles that have been floated for years about, can white people sing the blues? Is it so embedded in African American, not simply experience, but embodiment, that it only has those. It's in its only authentic form is it coming from people who've had those authentic experiences. It's similar to the discourse in hip hop, where it's only people who have had the experience of African American urban culture, starting in, obviously with the influence of everything leading up to the 70s, but basically the 70s and 80s and the growing or the resurgence of racism under the Reagan administration and so on, that only those people are able to actually be authentic hip-hop artists. And so even African-American suburbanites, or African-Americans with not necessarily a huge amount more privilege, but just like one echelon, had that tendency of often sort of being immediately ostracized. This is not really the case in the past 15 years, but think about like how Kanye, when he came out, was wearing polo shirts and so on, and it was a specifically different aesthetic. It's like, no, I am not of this, and yet I can still participate. That was a radically different aesthetic, not to mention the sort of the arguments that Eminem has had to make about, apart from skin color, I've had the same sort of experiences that give validity to the art form. Because otherwise there's the sense of it being posed. And so people have this connection between certain art forms of artistic expression and the and markers of authenticity, how people are meant to be, how only certain people are entitled, or only certain people have the background in order to perform this. And so the Bluesmen were entering into this, and I don't think they necessarily thought that. Because often that is not something that the artists themselves care about, but that recognizing that there are these measures of authenticity. Here's another interesting parallel: that strange discourse that only people who can speak Gaelic can play Celtic fiddle, Cape Breton Celtic fiddle. And because there's something about the language and inflection and so on, which is a marker of authenticity, which can be jettisoned when we care, and it can be reintroduced when we don't care. So it's this really interesting boundary keeping. I don't think musicians actually care that much, but this sort of these gatekeepers of the tradition, the people who are around it, the people who are somehow invested in this question of authenticity, they have this. And so the Bluesmen recognized that in order to be a professional musician, this goes back to Neil Rosenberg's idea of the difference between an amateur and a professional. And Neil Rosenberg's work on this was coming out at almost the exact same time as Pearson's. And I think they probably had some overlap in that the difference between amateur and professional is not, obviously there's getting paid, but it has very little to do with talent, because there are amateur musicians who have technical mastery that's far beyond many professional musicians. That is not the issue. The issue is about cultivating an audience. The issue is about building a reputation for competency, for fluency, for idiosyncrasy, for a show, in other words. And that is part of the professional's craft. And one of the things that Rosenberg talks about is how that takes place as much off the stage as on the stage. And so there's kind of like almost a Goffmanian sense of on stage, off stage, and versus backstage. And so the whole process of doing radio interviews, of establishing a reputation, establishing yourself as a known commodity is part of the exercise. And Pearson is doing the same thing. That after a while, the bluesmen recognize that what is being sought are these markers of authenticity. And so their narratives are not fictions, because they are of this background, but they are of the topical relevancy that they understand their audiences are interested in hearing in order to validate their audience's own appreciation of their own music. This is my experience, and my experience is often remarkably contiguous with the subject matter. So there's this wonderful quote, so about Honey Boy Edmonds. Let's see. His anecdotes of other artists also stick with blues-related subjects, and generally his entire story deals with subjects that are easily tied to the bluesman and in some cases can be found in blues songs. So we have this category, this character type of the bluesman, of this cultural figure that has a understanding, a culturally known understanding. People, once you identify that character, there's certain associations one has with that. They can be, they can often be about struggle. They can often be about, certainly eventually triumph over adversity, often working class, in fact, almost exclusively working class, often of rural background, often with woman problems, often with a tension between the secular calling of blues and the religious calling of the church, problems with parents, problems with drink, problems with all these things that we might associate. I use Pearson's work in my study of stand-up because the stand-up comedian has a similar cultural understanding in that, oh, well, they come from adversity and it's only with pain, it's only lives of pain that are able to, the humor arose as some coping mechanism in order to accommodate, and that they hold up a mirror to the self, that they're kind of these outsider loners, and yet they speak truth to power, and all these things are associated with the name stand-up comedian. Similar things are associated with the bluesman. And stand-up similarly, in addition to what they do on stage, which is even more performed autobiography than the bluesman, because the bluesman can be speaking from a character that is similar to the self, while the comedian is almost exclusively dealing with a performed autobiography. So the bluesman is, but the comedian, will also conduct interviews and participate in other artistic forms that help to cultivate their reputation so that when they go on stage, they're going to be understood properly. They are all about keying the next audience, and so are the bluesmen's stories. So they become adept. They understand that the interview is a natural context for story. So as we talk about personal experience narratives, and we talk about how people frame their experiences in forms of objects of aesthetic appreciation. So yes, there's the idea that they are authentic, the idea that they are honest, the idea that they are true, which are perhaps semantic, but maybe not distinctions. I don't think those three words are wholly synonymous, but they're sort of orientations towards this. They're also polished. They're also going to hit the expectations of the audience as they hear it. I know, as a bluesman, I know what this person wants, and I need to express my story as both distinct and unique. I am this person, while also I am representative of this thing that you already have a emergent, tacit anticipation of. I am myself, and I am a bluesman, and this is how my story fits into that received category. And they can become quite, again, he points out that some of the younger bluesmen, probably younger bluesmen who hadn't had that experience of having their careers disappear, shy away, push away from that bluesman idea. That fundamentally they think it's sort of racist. They think that they are sort of playing to a white audience, and there's a distinct argument to be made there. And so, I mean, this isn't a straightforward account. So about that, this is Otis Rush, who is a younger bluesman. Primarily a matter of individual personality, his response also reflects the younger generation's attitude towards the blues business. Unwilling and possibly unable to tell a story in the manner of the older artists, some younger musicians consider the bluesman image old-fashioned and somewhat degrading. Wishing to be accepted for their musical performance alone, they refuse to act the part on stage or off. Rejecting older performance techniques they scornfully refer to as clowning, their attitude towards their art is progressive, and they see the bluesman stereotype as holding them back, preventing them from being recognized as artists. That is as legitimate a take. And I guess maybe it's a matter of generational privilege. I do not know. It is not my prerogative to speak on that. But it is a really interesting idea that the bluesman, the blues performer, has recognized that the press, whether that is Rolling Stone, pop journalism, newspapers, or whether that is ethnomusicology and folklore and popular music studies and speaking to the academy, was they're aware of the distinctions and aware of the differences. It's all about maintaining a reputation. It's the performed creative self, in a way that all these personal experience narratives are fundamentally about a performed self. That performance is not inauthentic, that performance is not disingenuous, but that performance is keyed towards the specific context. So the bluesman's personal experience narrative becomes part of their repertoire. They have a skill set. They have a way of presenting themselves where they're creating a figure that is more or less contiguous with the expectations of the entire ethos of the blues. That it is born out of pain, that is born out of hardship, and yet the music itself fundamentally becomes something, what's the word we should use, salvific? Something that actually, at the very least, expresses that pain and becomes some form of catharsis. This is, of course, my $5 words, but I believe that is sort of one of the fundamental expectations. So Pearson's main argument is that these are artistic creations, that they are, they're not, I mean, it's not that the bluesman has sat down and worked out a story. It's through repeated interview. It's through recognizing what works and doesn't work. It's through, it's also through sometimes being in live performance, because even though talk between songs can comprise part of the bluesman's story as well. It happens on stage. It more happens in interviews just because of the nature of blues performances. But when it's done on stage, you get the sense of a large audience's reaction, and therefore your off-stage narratives can be keyed to knowing what works with an audience. What are those things that we are looking for? What are those markers of how to interpret the song previous, but more importantly, how to interpret the following song, the next performance? Because that's what constitutes a career, is creating, maintaining, building an audience. And you can see that in a number of people. You can see that in Dolly Parton. You can see it in country music all the time. You can see it in hip-hop. You can see it in punk. You can see it in any music that suggests that that only people with certain experiences can play it and have this sort of cultural arbiters. And it's not that these people are wrong. It's just that we should recognize that maybe at the very least that regulation is fluid. Because you have Joe Strummer, who is of a reasonably upper middle class perspective before he joined the Clash, and it's like, yeah, I'm not going to say Joe Strummer can't be punk because he was in the Clash, for God's sakes. Little Joe Strummer diatribe. So anyway, what I love about this is that it's a reaffirmation. He's not. I mean, Pearson is a folklorist, at least folklore adjacent, and he's not necessarily using much of the language of personal experience narrative, but it's a really great complement to the study of personal narratives, because it's now introducing this certain form of, at least, professionalism. I don't want to say they're instrumental, although there's a certain instrumentality to them. But that reduces them to something cynical. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's a matter of creating a self that is conducive to performance. I had one trail of thought, and I sort of dropped it for a second in terms of the onstage and offstage in between. But again, the Bluesman character, unlike in stand-up, and unlike, well, no, not unlike in many other many other genres. In fact, quite the opposite. Many genres of singing and song making have some kind of implicit connection between the worldview of the protagonist of the narrative, and often, because songs are similar, many lyrics are done in first person, and the person who is singing them. So, you sort of need to feel them in a way, or only certain people are entitled to, or maybe not, on a genre level perhaps, but only certain, but you at least have to make the argument for why one sings one's songs. I mean, all of Sinatra's songs are about a world-weary, hard-drinking, tough guy exterior, deep romantic interior. He's not singing pop songs that don't work in that. And his interview style, his life, also tie into that sense. So it is across the board. But for the Bluesman, especially, and I think what's really doubly interesting with this older Bluesman generation that he's talking about, I think what's of critical perspective is the fact that this is often part of the blues revival, and that they have had that experience, have that connection, and of course biographies where they're talking about their connections with key, very famous people, like so many of them have, like Robert Johnson stories, the guy who sold his soul, the Crossroads, and it's the basis of the greatest folk movie ever made. What was I saying? Yeah, so these markers, I've played with the greats, I have had this experience, but many of them have had their careers taken from them when the audience wasn't there. When, for whatever reason, World War II being a significant one, and just like a shift away from the very institutions that allowed for having this as a full-time career, and then basically, fundamentally becoming sort of passive tradition bearers, as it were, to use Kenny Goldstein's terms, and then re-emerging, having been rediscovered, and recognizing that, no, this is something that I have to work at. It's this wonderfully, what is the precise word I'm looking for? Frank discussion, because they need to tell these stories, because they're perhaps ever so slightly, I was about to say the word pathetic, but that's not right, but their audience craves them. They don't demand them. They crave these stories. They want the person on the stage to have lived this life. And then that gives their participation in this performer's music greater depth. And the Bluesman knows that. And so, how is this applicable in your life? We all do this. We might not necessarily do it out of professional necessity, but we are inventing, or we are putting the Instagram filters on our life stories. It's there. There's an authentic thing there, but we are framing it in just a particular way that is most conducive to what we think works best for our situations. And it's not dishonest. It's not disingenuous. It is what we do. And here we just see it in stark relief. Here we see it because we have the benefit of having multiple interviews. And we can see how this same personal experience narrative gets told and retold and shaped and honed, finessed. It's quite wonderful. All right. That's it. That's all I'm going to talk about. So this has been Barry Lee Pearson's, excuse me. You know what you're going to get now. Interviews. My name is Ian. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best. Take care.